Welcome to another edition of the Svarim Chatter podcast and another episode in the mini-series here on the podcast, the history of the early printed Hebrew book. In this episode of the series, we are going to continue where we left off, which was Venice and Italy in the 16th century, and we're going to now go to the latter half of the 16th century and onward and talk about the spread of print beyond Italy. So again, as I said at the end of the last episode, although it's the history of the early printed Hebrew book, we're going to go, this is still the early printed Hebrew book, but then we'll go a little bit further before we end off with episode 4 on much later. And once again, I am joined by Michelle Margolis. Thank you, Michelle, for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
I also should mention that this mini-series is sponsored by Sefaria. If you've ever wanted instant access to Torah, Talmud, and hundreds of other Sfarim, all at your fingertips, fully searchable and cross-referenced, Sefaria is for you. Sefaria is a free digital library of Jewish texts in Hebrew and in translation. Whether you're learning Daf Yomi, preparing a shir, or just looking to explore something new, Sefaria makes it easy to find sources and dive deeper. You'll find Rishonim and Achrayim, Sifrei Halacha, Mefarshim, Chasidus, and more, all on your phone, tablet, or computer, and everything is completely free. Visit www.sefaria.org, that's sefaria.org, to start learning today, and of course they have an app, and you can find more information in the show notes. So, as we turn to the spread of print, I know there's something that, Michelle, I know you wanted to highlight here, which is, and we've mentioned this, but I think we need to emphasize and make it very clear that although we're firmly in the era of print now, at the latter half of the 16th century, right? Everyone, that's what we're holding, the 1500s, manuscript continues to thrive.
Yes, absolutely. So certainly for areas of like Kabbalah is going to be mostly in manuscript because it's a secret. It's something you learn directly from your Rebbe, and that's something you do privately. There are books of Kabbalah that are printed, but also a huge amount of Sfarim that are handwritten. There are other places where manuscript continues because there are no printing presses, or because a nusach for tefillah was so small, like in the Comte de Venison, the area in the south of France. We're talking about 5 cities who have this particular nusach, or in Yemen where there are no printing presses. So their particular Sfarim to particular places are still going to be produced in manuscript. As you get into a little bit later into the 18th century, manuscript is going to be something that's like a special thing because books are so ubiquitous. But you really do continue to see manuscript throughout. Also books that were that would not have passed the censorship test. So anything that was anti-Christianity, anything that would have been not approved, or would have been dangerous to disseminate in large capacities, would be produced in manuscript. But thinking about printing ends up conflating a lot of things in one. We talked about this a little bit in the last episode, where you have decisions that are made by printers about what gets printed. This is especially pertinent in Sidurim, where they or Minhagim, books of halacha, where they printed books and they said, this is the halacha, or this is the minhag, or this is the nusach of the entire Ashkenaz and Poland and everywhere else. And so essentially they conflated what was maybe 5 or 6 or 10 different nuschos into one sefer because they wanted the sefer to have as far reach as possible. And so a lot of those distinctions that were city by city for minhag especially, and also tefillah, would be conflated into sort of one. The example that I think of today, actually, a friend of mine told me that her husband is Syrian, and they daven at a Sephardi shul, which is Moroccan, because in her community there is no Syrian Nusach minyan, and so they go to the one that's sort of close but isn't the same, even though it's not the same thing. And so you have this now with even though those are very distinct nuschos of tefillah, they end up having to be combined. So that's what was happening in many places with davening with Sidurim as well.
Correct, and we see this again oftentimes throughout Europe, and it comes up. Things circulate in manuscript. Ari Noyam of Yehudari Madonna comes to mind. That circulates in manuscript until it's published in the 19th century, but it's very well known. It's used by many, and such works. There's many others that just circulate in manuscript. The analogy I always use, think of it as like a Word doc or even a PDF that just circulates on WhatsApp, and it's like, oh, here it is. You're using it, or even you have some like dissertation. That's different, but like a dissertation that like circulates, wasn't published as a book, or things like that. It's just like a Word document like circulating around, so it's still there and it's edited and being worked on or whatever, but it's not like
it's not coming to print. It's not done enough to print.
In fact.
It's dangerous.
Yeah, and you even find manuscripts that were like made from a sefer. Someone didn't have, they couldn't get access to the print, and they copied it over by hand.
Many cases of that. We have an example of a book that doesn't exist, but it has a printer's mark. I may have said this in the first episode, actually. And we know that there's a reference to this printing in one of the old bibliographies, but we don't know of any copy of that book existing. We just have this manuscript copy of that book, including the printer's mark. So there's all sorts of overlap between print and manuscript. Also, often you see that if pages were missing from the book, somebody would replace the pages in manuscript. They would write them out by hand so that they would have it. There's so many examples. Yeah,
you could just go onto BidSpirit now and look at any of the auction houses, and it comes up all the time where you'll see, oh, this one is missing these pages, a chasser, but they went and they hand wrote it in. Yeah. And sometimes even hand wrote the title page often, which is very cool. It's missing, and someone went in and wrote it in. Sometimes they're quite interesting, especially for a library or for someone that wants to have, examples. I'm sure for you, this is quite fascinating to show people that come by and say, look, this is, so it has more of a value to you than just some private collector. Look, someone actually went and added this title page or this missing page that was missing, and they put it in by hand. So again, even though manuscripts continue in this point, and we're emphasizing this is an era of print. Svarim are being printed, and we're really firmly in the era of print. Now, let's move out of Italy, and let's move, I think, should we start with Prague? Should we start with Poland? Where should we start?
So I'm just going to run through a list of names. I think that no matter what, we're going to end up missing somebody's favorite city, and we're going to hear from your readers about how could you not mention this most important place of printing? And we're not going to mention everything. We're sort of just running through a whole bunch of different places.
And like we said in the last episode, this is just supposed to be a thorough and informative miniseries. However, it is not a college course. It's not a book. It's not. Obviously, we're going to miss stuff, and for the sake of time and not boring listeners with technicalities, we're trying to be thorough, but we also don't want to get every little nitty gritty. Even in Italy, we didn't talk about every small little press. Yeah. We kind of moved past it. Okay, so
I'll put my librarian hat on and say, if you want more information about any aspect of what we've talked about or didn't talk about, email Nachi, and I will happily send you a reading list.
Perfect.
Okay, so I'm looking at a map that's from the Posen Library of Jewish Civilization. The Posen Library is posenlibrary.com.
I will link to it in the show notes.
Okay, great. It's a wonderful resource with a lot of primary sources, and there are a whole bunch of resources on early print. So they have a map. I'm just going to read off names of towns. This is from 1500 to 1750. Vansbeck, Hamburg, Amsterdam, London, Firth, Dessau, Salonika, Istanbul, Izmir, Tzfas, Cairo, Modena, Krakow, Lublin, Breslau, Basel, Offenbach, Florence, Livorno, Modena, Mantua, et cetera, et cetera. So you see that printing is moving all over the place. It's mostly in sort of Central Europe, but there's a little bit in, farther east, a little bit farther north, a little bit in the Mediterranean. You have printing sort of all over the place. And again, we talked about this last time a little bit with Soncino. Jews move, and they are bringing print, these technologies with them. So maybe we'll start with Prague, because they're one of the earliest places that we talked about, that we'll talk about, although Constantinople is even earlier. And most of what I'm going to discuss here, I highly recommend if you're interested in printing in Prague. There's a wonderful book called Hebrew Printing in Bohemia and Moravia, which discusses the printing in Prague. The first book printed in Prague was a Siddur, printed in 1512. And a lot of these copies exist in these volumes exist in maybe one or two copies. Sometimes we don't have anything other than a reference. And again, we mentioned this last time also, but the importance of paratext. So the importance of reading the introductions and the title pages, talks about backers who backed out, talks about burning Jewish books. You have all of these snippets of information that actually discuss the history of what's going on at the time in Prague, just from looking at the non-textual text in some of these books. Sometimes we only know about books because an edition lists itself as a second edition. We don't know what's been lost. Again, we referenced that last time. So there are a lot of firsts in Prague. We have a Birkat Hamazon printed in 1514. And then probably the most famous book printed in Prague is the Haggadah. So the Haggadah is printed in 1526. It is lavishly illustrated. There are a few facsimiles that you could buy today, and I highly recommend that. They're beautiful. They're done in this, what I call a sort of Gothic font. It's based on the handwriting that was used in Central Europe. And it's very square. It's very solid. It looks almost like Savashuris, like what would be in a Torah. Very sort of heavy font, but very clear. They're really beautiful books with unique layouts and illustrations. You find that the decorations, the illustrations are just quite beautiful. The Prague Haggadah was so popular. There were copies printed on vellum and printed on paper. They're very rare and dear today. If you wanted to buy a copy, very hard to find. And if so, they're for many, many hundreds of thousands of dollars. But they printed a Haggadah in Mantua in 1560 that was basically trying to imitate the Prague Haggadah. So clearly they saw that this was a successful print, and they said, okay, we're gonna print a similar kind of thing. And it's almost exactly, there's some differences, but almost exactly the same illustrations. You have itinerant printers coming through Prague. Somebody like Chaim Shochar. He started in Prague. He went to Augsburg, Ichenhausen, Lublin. He's selling books in Italy. So these printers are sort of bringing their type with them everywhere they go. The other thing that we see in Prague is very early use of Viberteich. So this is the font that's being used. Viberteich is used for Yiddish. So that's why Viber, because it was for books for women and men like women, meaning those who could not read Hebrew. And that's actually based on a manuscript handwriting that was used for Yiddish. If you look at manuscripts of Yiddish, they use this particular handwriting in order to write in Yiddish. And that's what this font is copied from. And we see that first in Prague.
Yeah, that's kind of that distinct Yiddish font. For those that are familiar with, have seen those Yiddish Svarim, you'll find whatever that is, Tzenorena, but that's...
Tzenorena is really... I don't know if Tzenorena has it because it's so...
I don't think it does. I think it has a regular font. But that's like the famous Yiddish favorite. Actually, now that I come to think, it doesn't have it.
I'm not sure, but the earliest ones...
They have that font.
Yeah.
But, yeah, you can look it up.
You see it in like Lublin books printed in Yiddish. There are books with you did a podcast with on books printed in Yiddish with Mars Fairstein, and a lot of those Yiddish imprints, those early Yiddish imprints, use that Viberteich font.
Okay, so that's really Prague, and as you mentioned, there's
so much more.
Of course, there's so much more, and Prague is always a very important city, of a Jewish city. I mean, we're talking about the Margolis in the 16th century. Margolis printing his own farm there at the end of the 16th century. Some of his drushes are printed by him and others.
And of course, you can't forget the collector of Prague, whose collection was not in Prague.
He comes later, but you have the morale. You have the Kli Yakar. You mentioned Mekres Gedolos last episode, and the Kli Yakar is there, and the Kli Yakar ends up getting included in the later Mekres Gedolos. I seem to recall that has to do with that he's on the Vada Abarotzes, and that's under the Vada Abarotzes, which is in Poland. But I'm sure if that's wrong, a listener will correct me. But I think that has to do with how the Kli Yakar ended up, because the Kli Yakar is more like drushes. I mean, he writes has many other drushes for him. A number of them have been reprinted lately. But okay, that's Prague. Now, Prague is not Poland. Let's move to Poland.
Yeah, we're sort of jumping around the map.
Correct.
So in Poland, you have printing pretty early in the first half of the 16th century. There's a really interesting controversy that happens in Poland. Essentially, the Jews, the printers in Poland, in Krakow, converted to Christianity. It was lucrative to convert to Christianity. All your debts were forgiven, and you could do more things. You were much freer. But the Jews of Krakow then boycotted the press. They said, okay, these are all mishubadim. We're not buying from their press. And the printers the printers were going to go bankrupt. They went to the authorities, and the authorities forced the Jews of that town to buy the entire stock of the press. Now, according to some scholars, the printers later reverted to Judaism. They moved out of Krakow elsewhere. But there's a wonderful article by Edward Fram and Magda Tedder that goes into this controversy in great detail.
Yeah, it's a fascinating article for those interested. So I don't know if it's available that we can link to it, but really a fascinating and unfortunate. And this is something that happens not only Jews that converted, but for some reason in the press, this is something that we talked about in Bomberg's press and others, where you have a lot of the editors and those involved convert, either they are Mishum Adam already or they convert to Christianity. I don't know why that seems to be so prevalent. I don't know.
It could be just had to do with lack of that they were allowed to do more things, and it was more likely that they were going to make money on what they were doing. It was lucrative, and maybe it was also they felt strongly about it. We have a book printed in Krakow by that's the Mevia Ledfus is someone named Reisel ben but Yosef Levi or Reisel Revishals, because her husband was Revishal. And she writes in the introduction of her book, again, the introductions are so rich with stories and history, where she writes, I brought this, it's a Yiddish commentary on Tehillim, which is kind of something you would expect, that would be something that would be for women, that a woman would bring to press. Tehillim is so much in the realm of women. I mean, everybody reads Tehillim, but and she writes, she brought this to press so that both men and women would be able to understand the words of Tehillim that they're printing. So you have even women are printing and are bringing specific books to the press for other women to read, and everybody. Turning to Germany, so we have Central Europe. It's not called Germany at the time. You have Christian Hebraeus printing in Izny and Augsburg. Also some Jewish printing in Augsburg for a short time. And again, these books are printed in the same style as Prague, where you see this like very square typeface. It's very interesting because you can look at, just by looking at the book, you can tell where it was printed, because the typefaces are so unique to particular places. From there, we can move across the sort of known world. I guess they knew about the Far East, but let's move to Constantinople. So already in 1493, we have the first book printed in Constantinople. That's the Arba Turim, printed by refugees from Spain. And that's the Ibn Achmias brothers who come to Constantinople. They set up a press. They're printing right away in the early part of the century, followed by the Soncinos, who we talked about a little bit more last time. I wanted to just mention Eliezer Soncino prints a polyglot or a multilingual Torah in Constantinople in 1546. And this is really a unique thing because the Hebrew text of the Torah is there with the Aramaic translation, of course, and Rashi, of course, and then a Judeo-Arabic commentary, Rav Sadia Gaon. And I'm actually not so sure if it's Rav Sadia's translation. It might be a different one, and a Judeo-Persian translation and commentary. And so here you have, because it's being printed in Constantinople, you're dealing with a different kind of audience. And so you have to remember that there are Jews everywhere, just like there's Judeo-Italian printing in Italy, and you have Yiddish printing in Central Europe, and you have Judeo-Spanish printing in places where Jews came from Spain. You also have Judeo-Arabic printing and Judeo-Persian printing, because those Jews also needed translations and commentaries for works of Torah. And so it's really interesting to see that one. Near Constantinople was Belvedere, or Karusesme, I think is the name of the town she went to afterwards. So you may have just heard that podcast on Danya Gracia Nasi. Her daughter Reina Nasi, or Anna Nasi, was when her husband died, the Sultan in Constantinople basically took all of their money. He said, okay, it's mine now because your husband is no longer alive, and you are but a mere woman. And the only thing he left her actually was the amount of her ketubah. And with that money, she established a press, and she produced 6 or 7 books in 2 cities, which she writes on the title page are near Constantinople. It's really interesting to me that one of the books that she produced was the Alshich on the Book of Rus. And you think about this woman who started life as a converso, had all of these adventures with her mom, who was this very strong woman, and then came in, and one of the very few books that she printed was about Megillas Rus, which really talks about conversion or coming to Judaism, which was really an experience that she had. So even though that wasn't in Constantinople proper, it was just outside, and something that at least is worth mentioning as part of this. Did you want to?
And no, well, just to say that there are many other books printed in Constantinople. We hear all about the Kushna ones now. It became a whole big deal. And many Svarim, Barbanel has some Svarim printed there. Arama, the Rameir Arama prints there. The Chassid Yavis, his descendants go there. A lot of because this has to do with, and again, not for this podcast, but a lot of the Spanish exiles making their way to Turkey and the Ottoman Empire, and they're publishing there. And there's also Salonika, which is many Jews.
Very
it's almost like a Jewish
print.
city. Yeah. Many works being printed.
A little bit later. Yeah. I mean, there is printing in Salonika. Even there's a Catalan Mahzor that's printed very early in Salonika with the Catalan Nusach, because these are all printed for Spanish refugees.
Right. The Torah is printed there. That's your Torah that they take the type and they go and they move to Constantinople.
That's Constantinople,
right?
Yeah.
Yeah, they printed there in Constantinople. Yeah. So many works are printed there.
And Constantinople, they can freely revert to Judaism and say whatever they want. It's a Muslim country, so they're safe from the Christian law, I guess. So there's a lot, they can do different things there.
Correct. Now, this is also the period of Tzfas, the golden age of Tzfas, and the golden age of really Tzfas. And then you have a lot of many Rabbanim and many Jews in Eretz Yisrael at the time. Now, that being said, originally, many of those works are published in Italy. They're sent to Italy, right? Rabbi Yosef Karo is sending his works to Italy. Kesef Mishnah, Beis Yosef, Shulchan Aruch, as we discussed previous episode. Those get sent to Italy to be published in Italy. They are not published in Tzfas. They're not even published in Constantinople. They get sent to the press in Italy.
Yeah. Because that was the best press. I mean, that was, at the time, that was the best place to get your books published. Until the censorship.
Correct. So at that time, now we have a story, which interesting is the first work that's printed in Tzfas, actually, in fact, in the 16th century. Lekach Tov of Rabbi Yonatan Tzalon, later known as the Maritatz. Actually, he's much more well known by his Tshuva Sfarim. Lekach Tov is his commentary on Megillas Esther. Actually, was redone a number of years ago by Avad Shalom. It's still not very well known. This is the first book printed in Eretz Yisrael.
Yeah, in the 1570s. And that, it's again, I'm just coming off listening to the Dania Gracia Nasi podcast. And so that's exactly when she's trying to set up this settlement in Tiberia. But also there's this growth of people coming to Tzfas. Many of them are Sephardic refugees. Also, they're coming from Spain and Portugal. What's funny is that the printer in Tzfas actually his last name is Ashkenazi, but he actually is an Ashkenazi. Often you find that if the last name is Ashkenazi, they're actually Sephardi. But he was not. And he comes from Lublin. He started off in Lublin. He's printing in Lublin. He printed the Lublin Talmud which is completed in 1577. He then travels to Constantinople, prints a couple of things there, and then moves on to Tzfas, where he prints, again, 5 or 6 books there. So you have this short period of time at which they're printing in Tzfas. And I think that stopped because of an earthquake, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, that's the earthquake. And then it stops. It's interesting. Lekach Toiv, if you look at the title page, it says, Nitfas be'iyun rav, ki yara shama toiv alena bebeis ha'gvir hanale, Avram ben Anala, Rabbi Yisrael Ashkenazi, zal al yedei Eliezer ben Anala, Rabbi Yisrael Ashkenazi, zal ha'mochekek yisdos be'harei kodesh, b'tzfas, kiris melech rav, hi hayoyim takas mamshalas hadenenu ha'melech sultan moritz, Yares, it's printed under the sultan. And then it says, hayoyim yoyim, it actually has the day, shishi b'rosh chodesh, Sivan b'shnas, hey, Hashem hayoyzer li, Hashem is the king lahatz v'sfarim harbe lekayim ki mitzion tetzei tvaira udvar Hashem. Actually, it doesn't say Dvar Hashem Yerushalayim because he's not in Yerushalayim, but he hands off, keeps saying Dvar Hashem. So you see, he wants to do it. And if you look in the introduction as well, he has a short introduction where it's all about print, just skipping to part of it. Va'ata kumo asarim mashchu k'chu b'shevet sofer. Lilchim b'machamta shal Torah to fight the war of the Torah. L'lamed is b'nei Yehuda kesses haloi ksuba. It's written ish mi mamalachto yeshidvenu liboy v'yil lekav imoy loy me'ever le'yomhi. It's not from across the ocean. Leimar mi yitin efa v'yichtav and mili mi yitin b'sefer v'yuch. Who's going to put in a sefer? So you see, he's already Malitza. He's alluding to this fact that the books were being printed elsewhere and they were sending their manuscripts elsewhere. And they got to bring them to Eretz Yisrael. No, we're going to print them in Eretz Yisrael. He says ki kar v'lecha davar ata now ata ma'ayin. You the one that's looking close. So he's punning over here. Ozer no kagibar chalasecha bekesas hasoifer lahashir bracha acharecha bekerev haaretz in this land yad v'shem bechaseres beis Hashem tiftach yodcha yishmon toiv. And he says there's more flowery language over here about Eretz Yisrael, and he's talking about, etc. And so you really see there's a lot, going on about the print, and then there's a whole Hakdama from Rabbi Yom Tov Salon, who I believe was very young at the time. I want to say like 17. I'm trying to remember offhand. He was very young when he printed this sefer. And this again, and it's interesting also that this is the first work printed. It's from he's young at the time, and it's a commentary on Megillas Esther. This is the first work that's printed in Eretz Yisrael. You would think it's a more famous or important work, so to speak. It's not. It's this commentary on Megillas Esther that's published for the first time, first sefer that's published in Eretz Yisrael.
It's interesting to notice about Ashkenazi is that a number of the authors that he ended up printing, even back in Lublin, ended up relocating to Yerushalayim or elsewhere in Eretz Yisrael. So you wonder if he's printing all of these people who are relocating, and then he's sort of following in their footsteps as he ends up later in Sfas.
Obviously, we're being brief, and there's more to talk about, as we've said. But that's really through the end of the 16th century, going into 17th century, the different places that are really being published. Obviously, there are more places. I'm sure we left out some.
I should mention North Africa. There are printing. There's printing in Fez. There's like one or two books printed in a few different places in Cairo, but just like maybe one book, and then the press finishes.
Right, and so there's other printing going on in Europe, in Poland, and Krakow. We didn't really talk about, right? We talked about Lublin, but there's Lublin and Krakow and other areas of there that are Sforim are being printed. But really, we're before Livorno in Italy, which comes about later. But really, the next place to turn to is Amsterdam. So really, I think just first of all, this is like the end of the early printed Hebrew book. I don't know if you wanted to mention before we turn to Amsterdam, which is more like, I don't know if it's the early hinted, but that's like I don't know what you want to call it, the middle of the printing age printed Hebrew book. Well, is there anything to mention before we even get there? Like before we even get to Amsterdam, which really could have its own, should have its own series just on Amsterdam alone, which will include discussing print, something that I'm interested in Amsterdam and the Spanish-Portuguese community and the Ashkenazi community. There's so much there, but before that, I think we talked about title pages, and we talked about, I don't know, did we talk about the Sharblat and different things like that? Or is there anything more to just emphasize here before we turn to Amsterdam, like in early print? We talked about colophones, we talked about how important. I think there's something also to emphasize, I think we did, is that colophones and those type of things are often not reprinted. So you can learn a lot from a book. We did talk about your footprints, and you could see where a book was owned by who and where it traveled. But you can also see from looking at the actual book, like who was working on the book. You look at many books in the back of the book, they tell you like who was the one who like worked on the book. This is not something that ended up going on later. I mean, you find this especially in later books. Like a lot of times you have the Magia would write like a little sign, a little thing, or he
sometimes
would write
a poem. They would add
a little poem or a little comment, or you would have, it would tell you even like who was the drucker, like the setter. It doesn't even, those things don't get added later on, and a lot of this material just gets left out. So oftentimes you can find that a lot, and there's a lot to learn from. And then scholars, they write like academic articles on and like books, just like. But there's a lot of information there.
There's so much to.
That's just something that we wouldn't see otherwise.
Yeah. It's really quite amazing how much we get, how much history we get from the books themselves. You mentioned footprints. I mean, we have all sorts of stories. People write everything in their books. I mean, people, like, I remember my father used to write the dates that we were born in his Gemaras. Like, people write it in their Machzor. We have whole stories. There's a book at Columbia that has, I can't remember if I mentioned this in the first one, that has a list of earthquakes that happened in Livorno during a particular period, and there's births and deaths, and you see, there are 5 children born, 3 of them die, and you really get a sense. We don't understand what it is to I mean, never children don't always survive, but this was like standard that out of that more than half of the children would not survive. So you can see all of these things once you look closely into the books. Maybe before we go to Amsterdam, we'll talk a little bit about the halachic implications. There are a couple of things that came up in this was a new technology. How do you deal with this new technology? So we mentioned the Maharsha in the last. That wasn't so much halacha as a warning when you're learning Gemara of what you should be studying, but also the Taz. So late 16th, early 17th century, in Yoredea, 271-8. He writes, what happens if a sefer falls on the ground? And he talks about if it is it the same as a sefer Torah falling on the ground if a Torah falls on the ground? And he talks about how these are made out of stone, and is it the same as the Choshen? But they're not written with dough. They're not written with ink with the same kind of intention with kavana that you have when you're writing a sefer Torah. And so therefore, it's okay if you drop your. I mean, it's not okay. You kiss it, you pick it up, you put it back. But you don't have to fast for 40 days if you drop a printed sefer Torah on the ground. So these were real. Actual discussions. What is the meaning? What is the halachic meaning of print? There's a really interesting tshuva from Rav Moshe Provenzali on printing Megillot Esther, and he writes about Yosef Adolengi, who was a printer, and he said he printed 16 Megillos on parchment. And Rav Moshe Provenzali said, I don't understand. Why? How could you do that? And he said, well, it was amazing. I could print it. I could even print it. And he said, no, absolutely not. You cannot print these Megillos on parchment. And in fact, you have to destroy the whole thing because it's Lifnei Iver. Somebody might think that it's a real Book of Esther. It's a real Megillas Esther, and it's going to be used, and then it's going to be used for laning, and then somebody's not going to be Yotzei the Chova. And so these are, again, the Rabbanim were really grappling with what is the meaning of print? Does it have the same sacredness? Does it have the same meaning when you're using print? And that tshuva, again, is from the Posen Library. Another example of a source that on print that comes from there. And then you wanted to mention the.
And we can link to the Posen Library as well. It's a very interesting. The books are very expensive, but they have some nice sources. Actually, the Chuvas are printed by Mechon Yerushalayim. For those interested in checking them out, yes.
But the online version is free. You can find everything.
Correct.
You just have to make a.
There's
login.
definitely correct. There's definitely what to check out online. Yeah. Now, as it pertains to, so again, anything about like illustrated title pages, did we talk about illustrations? Because I know we talked about some illustrations. You talked about the Haggadah earlier, where you had the woodcuts, where they would create. I don't know, did we talk about how they created the woodcuts and how they stamped them?
I think we did in the very first episode.
Is there something that you want to mention about the title pages? And because we find in different places, different title pages, because now we're running through doing these quick hitters, and some places have more elaborate title pages.
Yeah.
We find the one with Moses with the horns and Aaron next to him with the breastplate, right?
Yeah.
And then you'll have ones, those are clearly taken from Christian imagery, and then you'll have ones where just like the word, and some
very
have
basic.
other illustrated. Like, what's going on with the title pages?
So, I mean, you find that as print gets more sophisticated, as the technology gets better, as illustration technology gets better, the printing becomes more advanced, and so the images can be more advanced. Once you get to the 18th century, certainly, that even by the late 17th century, you have really advanced illustrations. They're pretty amazing that are being produced at that time. The concept of a sharblot, of course, is because it is a sha'ar that's on the title page. It's an archway entering into the sefer, but the illustrations are a way to decorate the book. I mean, it's being mahader, I guess, as the book, but also you see printer's marks. That was a way for a printer to show this is my book, just like we have today on the spine of a book. You have the printers. We still have printer's mark. They're just on the spine of the book today, where you would see. I'm just looking at your library, so I see Mechon Ben Tzvi, I see JPS, I see Mozart Rav Kook, I see Littman Library. Those are all the printer's marks, which really come back from the 15th century. They were making their mark, literally. The other thing that I'm often asked is there are pictures that someone said to me, oh, that must have been designed by a Christian. That was definitely not a Jewish image, because it's an image that we wouldn't see on a Jewish book today. And that's because times were actually different then. Especially in places like Italy. And so you do have pictures. You have a shield. You have a family shield that has a picture of a woman on it. You have all sorts of things that you would not expect in a sefer. But, the Prague Haggadah, I guess I should give full disclosure, illustrates the part of the Haggadah that talks about, Bnei Israel when they just came out and they're compared to a woman. And that there's an illustration there because that's just, they were illustrating the text. This is sort of standard, the way that they were doing it in that time and place. And every time and place is going to be different.
Yeah, we mentioned the Mechabula, the last episode. Mechabula, at the end of Mechabula, it's got the modern day one. One picture's got, they put in beard and payas, and one just put on shirts with sleeves. You know,
right.
You can check, you can still see the original. I mean, that was his family's crest.
That was his family crest.
That he put it on there. And you have other various pictures you can check out. But when you have Moshe Rabbeinu with horns, I mean, that is from a Christian perspective.
That's a Christian perspective.
Then you can tell clearly that's where they took it from. You have other interesting one. They have the Shulchan Aruch from Reb Aryeh Finzi. He has the different pictures of the different, like they had, I think that's the famous title page. It's got 6 different like Rambam, I'm trying to remember who they were. One of them is himself. Like they have a bunch of it's like what they thought. I guess they were thinking they were.
And then in the first volume, and then in the second to the fourth volumes, they don't have the pictures anymore.
Correct,
because you don't put in pictures. And just like today, we have the first edition of the Making of a Gadol, and then we have the revised and improved edition. It's literally the same thing.
Correct. And you see it sometimes in some of these forums, which is quite fascinating to see. So we have title pages, we have woodcuts, we have illustrations. We didn't get to Amsterdam yet. We'll get to Menashe Israel and Rembrandt. We're going to get there. But you have, as you mentioned, colophones. We have different people that worked in the press, the Magia. And by the way, Magia is not, it's a little different than when we think of a Magia today, in some sense, because the Magia is like a corrector, as we talked about, the way they set the type, and they, as you got to check each page as it's coming off. And many, I talked about this with Moshe Maimon on the auction chat. We have many, I think you talked about the Ralbach, the Shuvas, we have different, basically, there are very, very different, many different variants, because as it was coming off, they were correcting, and this one was a mistake, and then they were adding a page and changing a page. So books it's not like where you take today and you press print, and then it just prints straight, just 1,000 copies. It wasn't like that, and often things were changed throughout, and that's why you have them. So the Magia is making a comment, and then maybe Lebeis HaTfus, like the acquisition editor or the publisher, and then the publisher is making a comment, and the authors. You have many different interesting material. And again, some of this is not reprinted, so there's a lot of interesting material. Something else that's worth mentioning, I think, and I've mentioned this once on an auction chatter, so sometimes those can get lost to put here on a podcast, is that in the series, is sometimes you have books even that were printed for Pidyon Shvuyim. People got captured, and so, we have today hostages, but there's not an issue of Pidyon Shvuyim, unfortunately. But here's an issue of Pidyon Shvuyim. They got captured, and they were trying, hopefully money would be able to get them out. And so one of the books, actually it's 2, Kol Yaakov and Mizbeach Yaakov, Yaakov Margolis, and this was, he was a Jew from Poland, and post Tach V'Tat, 1648-49, it seems like his family was captured, and he printed this book, a little small book of drashas, a couple of small books, and it's actually quite moving, and he talks about for Semes ain't tzarich raya. I don't need to explain like the famous things. And he says, I'm skipping around. Hagzera hara, this bad gzera haba aleinu on eretz Polania that fell us in Poland. Asher kibalnu din shemayim aleinu, that we will kabel the din shemayim. Asher lacherev lacherev, those for the sword to the sword. Vasher larav larav. Vasher lashvi lashvi. Kolam, right? Those that were supposed to die by hunger and those who were supposed to be captured. Kolam ocher bepasa kashim mikulam. Each one was worse. Kibashvuyi kulu isnu bi v'chulu. Everything is when they're captured. Vani b'tech hagoyla. I'm in the goyla. I'm wandering around. Shavu oisiv as beniv as biti v'hoilichu oisanu bagoyla b'chbale shel barzel anu b'chevel ragli v'hisu oisiv v'esbenim mishpachti we base of you eretz meladati my family el eretz acheres came as a different land. Right, they took a lot of them to Turkey elsewhere. Kirgershuni mistapeach benachas kedoshim amarti el chali lagdolim al gosh kech lehem lohitzi mimiskar asir. Let me go to the gedolim, to the people that have the power to get them out of jail, essentially out of captivity. V'akel shaboros olam b'tzedakah, Hashem that created the world b'tzedakah, who yoytzi yasim in a shivya, he took me out of a shivya. Husi b'lechalasi, Hashem is the reason for everything. V'nosan oisi l'rachem l'mufnei anshe segula, he put me in front of anshe segula. Hema anshe shem toiva sheba eretz hema divim tzadikim chasidim b'nosh kadoshim, the sons of kadoshim rachmanim b'nei rachmanim, compassionate people, sons of compassion. Akal kodesh kushtantina, so he's in Constantinople. Ubefrat hachachomim hashleimim Hashem oiskim b'toira leilis yomim v'oisim chesem b'nei Yisrael, etc. Part was he, and they redeemed him. He says, "Umana daber man tzadok kehim marshakeli." My life is embittered. Ki nishra li b'ni b'shivya. My family's in shivya. B'roiv magina vanin ani hoylech medina medina liquid al yad. I'm going around to collect im me'atvim harbe, little money to loyim hanidachim va'oivdim biyad zorim achzorim. They're in the hands of these horrible people. B'chol yoyim elai mitzapim. I'm waiting. I'm wishing for them. Ubenkach eyanti drush echel al kamagod. They say, look, there's some drushes and I got it to Gemorahs. He says, b'medrash galkut parshas ekev al posik la'avel odovka by dershi rishuma so aimer mitzayin chashatakar mish amar va'elam. Basically, liman haggadah, learn I got it to. Shemitoy kach, you'll come to recognize Hashem. etc. So he continues on, and there's more there. Basically, he says, he continues. He says, therefore he ends off. I took me out. I bend down on my knees. To say enough with his Torah. V'yareinu mitaras neflois mikol eis v'ois v'yet b'libenu avas teras lavadei say baruch Hashem l'elam amin amin. So he says, he thanks Hashem. Now he has another sefer called Mizbeach Yaakov, and in Mizbeach Yaakov he also says, Ani atalmud offer shel ragli talmidei chachamim menashem b'nei agoyla v'ani yishati levadi. I'm left alone. Mi beisi u'mebnei u'mikol nischim. Everything. I'm the one alone. I couldn't go anywhere. And he says, I told myself that I should print this book. It says, what should I say? My family is, again, I'm not going to read everything again. My family is there. What should I do? And he says, again, they had Rachmanis on him, and they took him. And he says, help me finish this mitzvah. Hashem should give you bracha. And he says, help me out. And basically he prints this book, and there's more that's written in there. So that's one work. Another work that's printed in Amsterdam in 1769, and we're going to get to Amsterdam, but just to mention, is Me'iri.
We promise.
Me'iri Masechet Megillah. And Me'iri is not published really in full till much later. But what's fascinating, and this is really a perfect example of what I've been mentioning, that a lot of material in Sfarim is not printed again. And it says, after it says the Holy Me'iri, it says, Hein Kol Zeh, this whole book, it was in the libraries, until Asher Heir Hashem es Ruach, Hashem was the Ruach Ish Novenu Maskil, Harav Rab Chaim, ben Rab Avram Kohen, from Belgrade. He had many tzaras. In his travels, to save his family. He only could print this. Now, there's a bunch of askamas from the Rabbanim in Amsterdam, Rab Shalom Shalem, Rab Shalom of Amsterdam, and Rab Shalom of Hague, and others. But when you go, it's in tiny font. So I'll try to read some of it. Again, I hope I'm not reading too much, but I think it's such a fascinating thing. And I don't think it's well known. He says, tiny thing. From the one who printed it. He says, I left my land. The ones who chased me, these enemies, I came to Amsterdam. Asher, he says, he basically talks a lot about the ones in Amsterdam. But then, I came to ask opinions for him. They're stuck in jail, or in captivity, really. Give Hashem, please. Anoshim, Anshe Chesed, Roit Fe Yosher. Again, all these platitudes, those he's trying to get money from. Yosher B'nei Akila Mufu Eres, Amsterdam, Ubnei Kal Kodesh Choin and Dal, Asher Behaga, and then in the Hague. And he's saying, please, they should give me money. He says, therefore, he decided to bring to print the Shita Masechet Megillah from the Me'iri. He says the Me'iri, that it was not printed. And he says that, therefore, I'll call Hamakam Asher Ilech Shama ki hasigu rechayke liu kedal dafik anol delas b'fnei hamapel tchinasi lefnei kol nedivi. Therefore, I'm asking, please, lefnei kol nedivi leiv is galgulin rachamim alai. Have rachmanis laharik mi brachasam lahashpia shefa nedivasam liknei sefer zeh. Please buy this book be'erech ma for something she yirtza roichav libam v'rotza nafsham ki l'tzedaka rabba techashev. It's a big tzedaka mamish pidyon shvuyim. Ish kematnas yodoy yibocher loy money yafa sefer Me'iri. So I don't know if there was no price to this book and you could just pay $1, $10, $100, $400, whatever you could.
You could use nicer money.
Clearly, you can give him money. Yeah. He says, "V'schus harava goyin hamachaber zatzukul the Me'iri yogin aleinu v'oz yaskil oira chayim lamayla v'oid kol yemei haaretz yimatzei." Oisher v'chavit v'chayim v'hoyin v'oisher bebeisei v'tzedakah emedes la'ad goyla u'metultul ka'echad ha'niyim limtzei pinyin shvuyim. I'm running around. I can't find pinyin shvuyim. I saw your chayim koyin in Belgrade. Sat. Sephardi Tahor, or whatever, Sefer Torah, whatever that stands for. So this is just a small little snippet from a Meiri published in 1769, and then I also read of Kol Yaakov Mizbeach Yaakov. Just fascinating how they used books as Pidyon Shvuyim. They were trying to go and publish books, and Yaakov Margolis, he wrote the book and then he printed it as to collect a little money, to get a little, either collect the money, also make his cause known. So Sfarim were not only using Pidyon Shvuyim, you see they didn't have WhatsApp and social media and Twitter and Instagram and
Right.
LinkedIn. So they were using this as their platform to kind of get that out there. And again, you see that in a little snippet in some of these Sfarim, and something like that, Meiri, I don't think that was ever reprinted again anywhere. And there's more little snippets in there, by the way. I don't think it was ever reprinted. And so you find that from that Sefer. And by the way, that's the Sefer print in Amsterdam. Let's turn to Amsterdam. Little snippet. This is Amsterdam is a community. It's, in the beginning, at least, Spanish-Portuguese Jews. They're former Moranos or Conversos. They returned to Yiddishkeit in Amsterdam. This is before the Ashkenazim, before the Chacham Tzvi and others. And they come there, and Amsterdam quickly, somehow,
So
becomes
Amsterdam was
hub of print.
It was a center of print, not just for Jewish printing. There's a wonderful book that I'm completely blanking on right now, but hopefully we'll put it in the show notes, about Amsterdam as a general center of print. So that was where people went. It was a port city. It was freer because it was not Catholic. You could do all sorts of things. People really came from all over. And you see that actually in the paintings of Rembrandt, since you mentioned it. You see all the different kinds of people who came from the East, from the West, from Africa, from all over, who sort of came to this center. Think of Amsterdam then as I don't know, New York now, or, a big center where everybody's coming to make their way. It was a very open city. There were very few restrictions, relatively few restrictions for that period. And so it was sort of a great place to be. There were Jews in Amsterdam. It was under the jurisdiction of Spain. So there was sort of a Spanish culture before Spain lost it. And so many conversos actually went to Amsterdam, right away. And then because they had the freedom to practice, because Amsterdam was not Catholic, the Netherlands was not Catholic, they were able to revert to Christianity. So Menachem ben Israel is the first printer in Amsterdam. He prints all sorts of books. You've discussed him many times on various podcasts.
Not enough, though.
There's more. There's one to be done just on him, as with so many of the topics that we're rushing through so fast here. And it really becomes a center. I want to mention a couple of things. If you're interested in printing in Amsterdam, the Studia Rosenthaliana is a journal that's produced by the Rosenthaliana Library, which is at the University of Amsterdam. And that focuses specifically on the community of Amsterdam. There are many, many wonderful articles about printing in Amsterdam within that journal, which has been produced for decades. So that's a really good place to go to. I'll mention just one article from that journal, which is Noam Sienna's Rabbis with Inky Fingers. Again, we have inky fingers. The article is amazing. It talks about a rabbi from North Africa who comes to Amsterdam to print his book, because that's where you go. That's where the best books are being printed in the 17th and 18th centuries. And he comes and Noam Sienna actually found the printer's copy of this Sefer that was printed. And he saw on the printer's copy, in addition to fingerprints, which are kind of amazing, he saw there were Yiddish comments on the side. So here you have a North African, somebody coming from the North African Jewish community coming to Amsterdam to a press that's owned by a Sephardic Jew, so a Western Sephardic Jew coming from the Iberian Peninsula. But the people working in the press were Yiddish-speaking Jews, because in Amsterdam, the Jewish community did not speak Dutch. They either spoke Spanish and Portuguese, or they spoke Yiddish. There was there were the two communities. There were the Sephardic and the Ashkenazi communities, and they were separate in a lot of ways. But in the printing house, that was where they came together. It's almost like if you read Bruce Nielsen's article on the Daniel Bomberg's press, he talks about how the press was a place where many different people came together who otherwise would never have interacted. So in Nielsen's case, he's talking about Christians and Jews. But in this case, in Amsterdam, it's actually different kinds of Jews who had totally different life experiences, who were doing totally different things, and would rarely have interacted with one another. But because of this sort of shared love of the book, if you might say, maybe a little romantically, they then came together. Like the books are what is going to unite the Jewish people. Another thing we mentioned, illustration. But so illustration is really in Amsterdam is done incredibly well. So you have people like Rembrandt who are producing illustrations. You have title pages that are produced by sort of the great Dutch masters, where they're designing title pages. Another book that's produced in Amsterdam, not particular. I might be getting it wrong. I don't know if the first edition was based on Amsterdam. There's a book that's produced that is focusing on religions and cultures of the world. So it's not a Jewish book at all, but there's a section on Judaism. The first volume talks about Judaism, and the images are all taken from the Sephardic community in Amsterdam. So you actually have, like, they're not photographs, they're drawings of the Jewish community of Amsterdam, including like their sukkah, which looked like a gazebo, but with schach. You have pictures of them cleaning for Pesach. I actually have a print of that in my house. You really get to see the intimate features of the lives of the Jews in Amsterdam because their community was so well known. They were heavily involved in trade. They were involved in the Dutch East India Company. And so they were seen as the representation for Judaism, which is very interesting. I'm going to mention London in the same breath as Amsterdam, just because the Sephardic community of London actually came from the Sephardic community, or was very much connected to the Sephardic community of Amsterdam. And I want to mention a book by Alex Kerner, Lost in Translation, Found in Transliteration, Books, Censorship, and the Evolution of Spanish and Portuguese Jews Congregation of London as a Linguistic Community. What's really interesting about what's going on in London is that, with print, actually, is that they're not allowed to print books in English. They're only allowed to print books in Spanish and Portuguese. They have a ma'amad, they have leaders of the community, just like in Amsterdam, and there are very, very strict rules. But the idea is that you don't use, just like I think the way that some people feel about even Yiddish today, that it's used as like this is the Kadosh language that we use among ourselves. We don't speak for those who feel this way, they don't want to speak the general language of the country. You had that with the Spanish and Portuguese Jews as well. And a lot of regulations around what could be printed. Again, Jews were very much aware that they were guests, sometimes just they were just, I can't think of the word, where they were tolerated in that area, but they could be kicked out at any minute. So there's this sort of danger in printing something that could be seen as offensive. And so there's a lot of controls around printing in many different places.
So much to say about Amsterdam, but just to cover it, they definitely dressed like those around them with their wigs and everything. We have some of the pictures and images of different ones, some of Rembrandt's drawings about some of them. We have that famous drawing of the shul of the Esnoga there in Amsterdam, which is still there.
There's one in Picard as well.
Yeah, so there's a lot of, and Amsterdam was the art capital as well. So you had so many artists, and Rembrandt, there's Stephen Adler has a book about Rembrandt and Jews.
There was just a wonderful exhibit at the Jewish Museum on Rembrandt and the Jews that talked about Rembrandt in his Jewish. Rembrandt lived in the Jewish neighborhood, so he
was
painted
friends with Menashe.
Jews.
We know
he was friends with Menashe in Israel, and just it was an incredible exhibit. It's actually going to Boston now, I think, and some other places. But it showed how Rembrandt and his circle of artists were also, I'm sorry, it's not Rembrandt and the Jews, it's Rembrandt and the Book of Esther, but actually it was through the Book of Esther. There's a lot about the intersections between the Jews and these artists who lived really around the corner from them.
And as I recall, so Professor Stephen Adler's book on Menashe ben Israel, that's when I did an episode on Menashe ben Israel, he talks about how you see that Rembrandt's drawing, you can see the pshat in Belshazzar with the Malach on the wall. You can see which pshat he was going with, the way it was written. And he says probably whether it came from Menashe or others. Menashe knew him. So it's very interesting to see a lot of that. And you can, again, the community was a fascinating community. And that was really the hub of print when you had, hundreds of books printed there and classics. I mean, you talk about Haggadah, the Amsterdam Haggadah, the first edition, second edition.
And then many, many copies of Haggadahs that are printed based on Amsterdam. This, everybody's just trying to be Amsterdam. And of course, we didn't even talk about Otiat Amsterdam, where then, even later, presses in Eastern Europe would say printed in, Derrenfurth in teeny tiny letters. And then in big letters, it would say Beosios Amsterdam. Right. So in the letters of Amsterdam. In other words, we're printing them like they're being printed in Amsterdam, because that is the top
Which came from
quality.
Menashe, right? They had really nice letters, really top quality. Amsterdam stuff is really nice. They had, there's this Rav Moshe Frankfurt, I think, the massive Chumash that he printed, the massive Tanakh, if you will, Mekores Gedolos. He included a lot of different Mefarshim. It's really beautiful. And there's many books that are printed. There are obviously Menashe's printing, and Menashe, Nishmas Chaim's in Hebrew, but other ones are not. He has all different languages, and many, again, many from the Ashkenazi community comes there. The Chaim Chazvi is Rav there, Rav Shaul of Amsterdam, and others. And so you can see by all the Sfarim printed there with all the different Haskamas. Someone should just do a study just on the Haskamas of the Rabbanim of Amsterdam to the Sfarim. I mean, so countless Sfarim that are printed there. Many of them really beautiful Sfarim, top quality Sfarim. We're not going to do justice talk about it. So again, Amsterdam is really, I think it's like the leading center of Jewish print for a while until the decline.
Yeah. And you have books printed in Yiddish, and you have books printed in Spanish, and you have books printed in Portuguese. You have, and of course, books printed in Hebrew. But there's so many, there's so much going on there that they're printing for such a broad audience. There's a book printed. There's a complete translation of the Tanakh, of the Torah, I think, into Yiddish. And the introduction says this is really for the Jews in Eastern Europe, and so we removed the Western Yiddish words because you wouldn't understand the Yiddish that we speak in Amsterdam. So we're taking out the Yiddish word, the words that would have been in Yiddish that we would have spoken, because we're printing this for export to you guys, you Ostjuden.
Correct. It was a business, and they printed things for export, not only for Amsterdam. So you had both being printed. You had the Eitz Chaim Yeshiva. They would publish their pre-Eitz Chaim, which I had a podcast about, their journal for 80 years or however long it went on.
And they were printing Gemaras for what was they were printing Sfarim that were being learned in yeshiva.
That's the Gemaras was the controversy between the Amsterdam Gemara and the one in Zoltzbach, I think, was the controversy. I talked about that once, and the Zichron Yosef is a tshuva on this, and then Amsterdam they had it was a back and forth. The one in Amsterdam defended the Amsterdam one, those of the defended Zoltzbach one, and put in Chayrim. There was we'll get to a little bit in the next episode on the Vilna and the Rum and the Slavita, the tumult there. I mean, this is often a controversy because, again, as I think should be clear already in this series, that print is a business. Then as now. And so people have to make money. People are trying to make money. Printers are trying to make money. People can't lose money. And so especially when you get to bestsellers and things that cost a lot of money, especially to lay out a new edition of the Gemara, the whole Talmud, it's a big money loser when somebody goes and prints another one. And now you lost part of your intended audience. And not everybody bought a Gemara. It wasn't like every bacher going to Bezivta picks up a Baba Kama.
Right.
They were very expensive. And so this is something that was hard.
That's why they had them for the yeshiva. The yeshiva bought a number of copies. I mean, David Sklar's work on this, and Benjamin Fisher's for Torah. You see that the yeshiva was buying copies, but they would be used in the Beis Medrash, it wouldn't have been called a Beis Medrash in Eitz Chaim because they were Sephardi. But
Yeah, they were Sephardi, and they spoke Spanish and Portuguese and all different languages, and some of the Sfarim have Latin in them. Nishmas Chaim has Latin in the beginning, and you have Michal Yofi has Spanish. That's actually open letters, so it's not even. Some of these were even written, as we talk about Christian Hebraism, and they were written for the Christians. They weren't only written for the Jewish community. So again, Amsterdam is really a very important community with a lot of print, and hopefully it's something that will do a full podcast episode. That's not really also early Hebrew print, so we just want to give it an entry here and to talk about its importance for printing. There are texts that just be like Chacham is first printed in Amsterdam. He was Rav there, but then he left. But that was the first printed in Amsterdam. So there are certain classical texts that were printed in Amsterdam that we have from Amsterdam, and there's many other. The Margolis, the first edition is there. He runs away from Nachvatat. He ends up there. So that's printed there in Shulchan Aruch. So there are certain important texts that are printed in Amsterdam, and so Amsterdam is an important place. As you said, anyone that should check out Oasis Amsterdam, check out the print of Amsterdam. It's really beautiful, the Amsterdam Sfarim, and so. That's really the big hub. But after Amsterdam, I think Livorno's kind of concurrent at the same time. The Livorno were
a little bit later.
The Livorno becomes.
They overlap for a little bit. But
what's fascinating is that Prince shifts back to Italy to become like a center, but like a totally different part of Italy and different community. It's like predominantly Sephardim and like real Sephardim in Livorno. It's a totally different. There's connection to Amsterdam, but it's a different community totally that becomes like printing in Livorno at the time, and then Prince kind of like spreads out all over. So I think what we're going to do here is we'll end it here at this episode, And at the next episode, just as a teaser, our plan will be we'll talk a little bit about Vilna and Rum, even though that's really not early Hebrew print. But I think it's always something that we get asked. And like, you did a series on print. Like, what are you telling me about the Shas today and Rum and the Rum family? And it's always a question there. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And then I think we'll talk a little bit also about the new technology and how print, changes with the 19th century and what the difference is between a press. And so we'll talk a little about that, and then we'll get in today. And this series is sponsored by Sefario. And as I mentioned in the first episode, it was their idea. And so I think it's something also worth talking about digital, but also because as it's very relevant and connected to early Hebrew print, because early Hebrew print is this new technology, and we're still living in the digital age and AI now, and different digital libraries, and things are being OCR'd and AI'd, and things are just changing all the time. And I think it's very relevant to talk about that. So that's something we'll discuss a little bit in the last episode and how that connects to the first century of print. So thank you, Michelle, for joining me for this third episode.
Thank you for having me.